told him, I can't have Skype on my computer. It's non-free software. Anybody who puts in a message what his Skype account is essentially saying, hey everybody, use non-free software with me. People shouldn't say that kind of thing if they want to promote freedom. So, we have a lot of work to do. And we're going to keep doing it. And thank all of you for supporting this work.
Questions for Richard?
Well, you started off saying that the proprietary software is evil. I mean, I always think evil means there's a gun. It's plunder or oppression.
Well,
but
no.
what do you mean by why is it evil?
That's what I mean. Well, I mean evil in the same sense that you are thinking of. But I don't define it as equivalent to using a gun. I'm not a right-wing anarchist, and I don't believe that everything is good except using force.
Right, so, but what's evil about it? You didn't give
It subjugates people. It makes the person, it makes the user helpless. So, to see the evil, you have to look at the four freedoms that define free software. Okay, I'm going to shut this down so it can recharge. This laptop has a problem that it can't charge its battery when it's running. So, this is an example of the kind of little sacrifices that I make for freedom, which don't make me any great hero, but what do you think of somebody who won't even make little sacrifices for freedom? Anyway, so the four freedoms are, freedom 0, the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1, the freedom to study the source code and change it to make the program do what you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help your neighbor, which is the freedom to distribute exact copies of the program to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, which is the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. So with these four freedoms, all the users can do what they want, and in particular they can make their computers do what they want. The users control their computing, and cooperation between the users is also encouraged and permitted. So what does proprietary software do? People are forbidden to share, and that is directly evil because dividing people is an injustice to them. And everyone who signs a license saying he will not share has committed an evil himself directly by making that promise. And then the developer has total control over what the program does because the users don't have the source code. So you're under the power of somebody else. Now, if using computers was something that a few people did rarely, it might not matter. But when you live a lot of your life using computers, it's intolerable for anyone to have that kind of power over you. But of course, the idea that something is unjust, whatever that something might be, is an idea that on which people have cultural views and on which they can be influenced by their culture. Many things that we consider evil were accepted at one time in the past, and some still are in some places. And people who use computers mostly started with proprietary software, surrounded by other uses of proprietary software, so they just took for granted that proprietary software is okay.
Excuse me, I'd like to contradict that. My father was one of the early computer users at a time when there was no proprietary software.
Right, but that's very few people. Most computer users today, right? starting in the 60s probably, or
Right.
maybe the late 50s.
In the 50s.
But in any case, that doesn't contradict what I said. You're
No,
right.
but we
but
started
most
with freedom, and
yes,
then we moved
but
to...
most computer users started with proprietary software. Most computer users started since 1990.
Right.
And they started with proprietary software, and everyone else they knew was using proprietary software. In fact, in 1990, you still couldn't run a computer without proprietary software. There was no free modern system yet. And so they just took for granted that that's the way it is.
I know one way you could do it, if you ran a Forth-only system.
Was there a free implementation of Forth in 1990?
Yeah. Well, free, there were published versions that you could change and distribute, yes.
Oh, well, maybe they were free.
Big Forth.
What was that?
Forth is a programming language that was designed originally for pointing telescopes and is now the basis of OpenFirmware.
So I have a...
Do you work on OpenFirmware?
Mitch Bradley does the main work on OpenFirmware.
But it sounds like you are involved with it.
I can get inside it, but I don't actually do the work.
So I have a question about kind of the dividing line between, free and open source software and the underlying
Well,
hardware.
actually, free and open source are not the same.
Okay. Pick one, and we'll talk about that one.
I should talk about the difference between them, and then we can continue with your question, because I'm not blowing you off.
Okay.
But this is really important. The free software movement is about ethics. It's about freedom and social solidarity. So what we say is letting people cooperate and control their computing is right, stopping them is wrong. Now, there are a lot of techies who don't like talk about right and wrong, and they don't want to reject any possible solution that might be convenient. So in the mid-90s, there was a big debate in the free software community between the people who support the idea of the free software movement and people who just like the software because it's convenient. And in 1998, the latter group started using the term open source. And they chose that term partly because the word free is ambiguous, and they thought, well, if they don't say the word free, they won't have trouble with that ambiguity. But also partly because they wanted to hush up the freedom side of things. And so they didn't want to allude to that at all. By using a new term, they could avoid ever mentioning that there was an issue of freedom. And open source people never say that it's wrong not to make a program open source. All they talk about is practical advantages of doing so. They treat non-open source programs as fine. And they only judge programs by their convenience. That's why I don't support open source, and that's why the FSF doesn't support open source. We're not in favor of their philosophy. And we don't want to talk about our software by their term, because if we did, we'd be boosting them. If you're in the Green Party, you don't put up signs saying Democrat everywhere. Or Republican, for whatever difference it makes. So, that's why in the FSF, we never talk about open source, except to say that it's something we don't agree with and why. Now, mostly it's the same set of software. Not exactly. There are a few exceptions, but they're rare. So if you find out that there is a program and you're told it's open source, well, you can be almost certain it's free software, but not quite. But in any case, so it's almost the same body of software. And if your only interest is in the body of software, well, you might call it free software and open source, and if you don't want to take a side. But we are a side. We want to take our side, so we don't do that most of the time. We just call it free software. Anyway, so you're talking about the difference between free software and...
Well, I'll get back to that in a second, but now I'm still trying to untangle something. All right, so use Skype as an example. I mean, from an end user perspective, that's free.
No, it's not, because you don't have the 4 freedoms.
Because it's not open source.
Well, because you don't get the source code. There's no
Okay.
need to use quote open source unquote to
Okay.
define what free software stands for, any more than the Green Party has to define its platform in terms of the Democratic Party platform.